What's up guys, I got a brand new video for you today, and this is going to be an interesting review. I reviewed the GH5 last year, and I love the camera. I love the ergonomics, I love the battery life, I love the IBIS, all the frame rates, internal 10-bit 422, 4K 60, and all of that in a camera under $2,000, and it's like currently like 1,800 bucks. But now that brings us to the GH5s, which I'm filming with right now. Some things were taken from it, some things were added to it, and we're gonna talk about that. So getting into the specs on the GH5s, we have a 10.2 megapixel sensor. It's a multi-aspect ratio sensor. We'll talk about that in a bit. 3.68 million dot EVF, 3.2 inch articulating touchscreen that comes in at around 168 million dots. Has dual native ISO of 400 and 2500. It has dual UHS 2 card slots, mic jack, headphone jack, full-size HDMI, and it also has timecode out through the sync port on the top of the camera. Just like the GH5, it has internal 4K DCI 10-bit 422, 4K 60 FPS, and 240 FPS in 1080p. It also comes with Vlog installed right in the camera out of the box. So I'm gonna cut to the chase. We're basically just gonna talk about video on this camera because 99% of the people that are buying this camera are buying it for its video capabilities. And the main reason why I say that is because it only has a 10.2 megapixel sensor, which in today's standards isn't really that much for photography. I mean, if you're shooting Instagram all the time, it might be fine. But the reason behind this sensor being so small is because they were able to pack larger photo sites onto the sensor and get better low light capabilities. Now, I've been shooting with this camera for a month, and just like the GH5, I love the ergonomics, the battery life, the button placement, the menus, everything about the camera just is really nice to use for shooting video with. Basically, the only thing they changed on the camera is the red ring on the top and the S underneath the GH5. But I brought this camera with me everywhere I could to shoot behind the scenes and stuff like that. I didn't really use it on any big projects just because I've been shooting my bigger stuff, client jobs with the C200, but I did bring this camera along on a lot of behind the scenes for other YouTube videos I was making. So as you can tell from the samples, the camera handles high ISO, no problem. I don't have my original GH5 to show side by side with it, but just trust me when I say I would never push that camera past 1250 to 1600 ISO. I am really picky with noise, and I was able to shoot with the GH5s up to 3200 ISO and sometimes even up to 6400 ISO, and I was pretty happy with how it looked. So the secret weapon behind this camera is the sensor and the dual native ISO that they brought over from like the VariCam. They also have it in the EVA1, but on this camera, it starts at a native ISO of 400, and it has a separate circuit on the sensor for another native ISO of 2500. And this allows for less noise at higher ISOs because it's able to jump to a higher native ISO without having to amp up the gain from its base ISO of, say, 400 and push it up there. So it can basically go from 400 up to 2500, switch circuits over, and then go up from there. So theoretically, you should have similar sensor noise at 400 ISO as you will at 2500 ISO. So I decided to put this theory to the test and put them side by side, shooting the highest bitrate possible. I shot this in Vlog. This is what it looks like graded. But if we look at ISO 400 versus 2500 ISO, don't worry too much about the noise because you're going to get that in the shadows in Vlog. But look at the hair and see the detail in the hair on ISO 400 versus 2500. Anyway, I want to take a look at some high ISOs and how skin tones look under those higher ISOs. stacking all the higher ISOs beside each other, I actually think that 2500 ISO looks better than 1600 ISO. Obviously, the higher up we go, there's going to be more noise, and I'm noticing less detail. But when we get to 12,800 and 25,600, it's still pretty good for a Micro Four Thirds camera, but there is a green cast. Now, I was so impressed with the GH5s at 6400 ISO, I wanted to compare it against my C200. Obviously, it's quite a bit more money, but I shot this in RAW just to see what it would look like and the differences. And there's quite a bit more noise at 6400 ISO than the C200. Now, when you shoot RAW, there's always more noise on the C200, but I just want to see what it looked like, and when we're comparing them here side by side, and we zoom in, I can actually see quite a bit more detail in the C200 still, so I don't know if the GH5s is doing some kind of noise reduction. I didn't have any turned on, but that's kind of what it looks like. So new to the GH5s is 240 frames per second in 1080p. I wouldn't necessarily say that it looks the best at 240 FPS. You start to get a lot of aliasing, you start to get a lot of noise, and it kind of softens up a little bit. It doesn't look quite as awesome as it could, but at 120 FPS up to 180 FPS, it actually looks really good. And I'd even say at 120 FPS, it looks really good compared to any other camera I've used at 120 FPS. Now when you push the camera up in frame rates, you get around 204 FPS. It actually has a small crop, and it has to crop in a bit to be able to handle that. Now, along with all the higher frame rates they added in 1080p, they actually added DCI 4K 60 FPS in the GH5s, which doesn't come in the GH5, but it does still have the same DCI 4K 10-bit 422 in 24 FPS and 30 FPS internally. If you want to get 60 FPS in 10-bit 422, you have to do it externally through the HDMI port. And something that I don't hear a lot of people talk about, which is actually the 1080p. The 1080p on the GH5s is amazing. It actually shoots in 10-bit 422 in 1080p, right up to 60 FPS. So if you can't get your 4K 60 FPS in 10-bit, at least you can get it in 1080p. And the quality is so good at 200 megabits per second that you could probably fool a lot of people that it wasn't 4K. So we need to talk about the autofocus system because, as you know, the GH5 doesn't have the best autofocus system, and the GH5s has the exact same autofocus system in it. It's fine for photos, but when it comes to video, it's not really all that accurate. It's not all that reliable. And there was kind of a fix that we found out using the 179-degree shutter, which actually kind of sped things up and got it to be a little bit more accurate and a little bit more responsive. If you want to check that video out, I'll put a link in the description. But the autofocus system is contrast detection only, and it doesn't really compare to the phase detection that's in other cameras. But if you have to get by and you want to use the autofocus system, if you set it to 179-degree shutter by turning synchro scan on, you can actually get pretty decent and responsive autofocus. Would I trust it? Not really. So as I said at the beginning of this video, they kind of took and gave the GH5s different stuff from the GH5. Obviously, there is no in-body image stabilization, which is kind of sad because the in-body image stabilization was amazing on the GH5, and it is amazing on the GH5, and it kind of sucks that it's not in this camera. Maybe they couldn't do it because of the dual native ISO, or they just didn't want to do it because some filmmakers said they didn't want it. In some cases, it actually can be worse having in-body image stabilization, especially in a situation where the magnetic field gets overpowered by shakiness. It can actually make it look shakier. And I heard that filmmakers were saying that they'd actually rather not have in-body image stabilization, so maybe that's why they did it. On the bright side, the rolling shutter is really low on this camera. It's not that bad. And if you have an image stabilized lens like the one I'm using right now, the 12-35, you can actually get pretty decent results handheld. So I wanted to come back to the sensor again. This is a Micro Four Thirds sensor, but it's slightly bigger, and they're calling it a multi-aspect ratio sensor. So because the sensor has a broader margin, it's a little bit bigger than the frame, you can actually change your aspect without having to change the crop. So if you want to do like 16:9 or 17:9, the framing doesn't actually change as far as the focal length because it doesn't need to crop in. It also allows you to shoot anamorphic up to 6K once it's de-squeezed. You can actually do it on the GH5 as well, but it's crazy that you can do that in a camera of this price range. Anyway, I think that's all I'm going to talk about in this review. I just kind of wanted to touch on all the main things. I already did review the GH5 and this camera is pretty similar to that other than the low light capabilities, but these are my final thoughts. If you primarily use gimbals or don't really care about in-body stabilization and would rather have the higher ISO capabilities, this camera is definitely for you. If you're a wedding filmmaker and you already have a GH5 and you're shooting in like dimly lit receptions and you kind of wish you had the low light capabilities, this might be a good option to add to your GH5 because it's still nice to have the regular GH5 with the in-body stabilization, but if you need that low light, you can use this camera in the reception and just kind of combo back and forth between the two cameras. The camera has amazing ergonomics, great battery life, tons of frame rate options, tons of bitrate options. It just seems to work really nicely. The menus are pretty good. Touch screen. The only thing really I don't like on it is probably the autofocus. Also, the price is a little bit steeper. It comes in at around $2,500 currently, which is almost $600 more than the GH5, which starts to make the GH5 look like an awesome deal. I personally don't think it justifies the fact that it's better in low light, especially since they removed IBIS. But I mean, if you need the low light GH5, this is what you're gonna have to buy. All in all, if this is the future for Micro Four Third sensors, like they're able to actually get this type of ISO sensitivity into other sensors without having to make it their low light camera, the future looks bright. I did not expect them to be able to push this camera this far in a sensor that small. And if you want to get a GH5s or a GH5, I'll put links in the description. If you want to watch my review on the GH5, I'll put a link in the description. And I'm also going to link the autofocus test that I did as well. But yeah, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike this video, give it a thumbs down twice. I'll see you in the next one.